on the philosophy of religion, in particular on Plantinga's evolutionary arguments against naturalism, or the naturalistic argument against evolution, however the heck that one's supposed to go.
It's an evolutionary argument against naturalism. I found out through communication with one of his colleagues that he doesn't actually disbelieve in evolution per se, so long as evolution is given a sufficiently neutral interpretation to allow that it might be guided by God. So it's really the naturalism part that he's rejecting, at least according to what a colleague of his told me. I was surprised because it doesn't really quite come out in his initial essay, Is Naturalism Irrational? It sort of sounds like he wants to reject evolution too, but I think he words it carefully, so he's on the fence about it. But I'm told that he isn't actually rejecting evolution. He's only rejecting the naturalism part.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me too much, honestly. He's
an intelligent design guy, basically.
Yeah, Plantinga has always seemed sort of sophisticated enough to realize that denying the science behind evolution would be sort of a suicide mission intellectually.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I mentioned this to you that one of my subscribers sent me a video that he was working on, making a similar sort of argument about to the one that you made in the article that you published, suggesting that actually our cognitive faculties are far from reliable, and that we've got very good reason to think that actually that we shouldn't trust them most of the time. Now, one of the things that one of the issues that I have possibly with that, or concerns, I wouldn't say objections, but I think this is where I think Plantinga would want to go in response to that strategy, were he to be confronted with it directly, is, well, if our cognitive faculties aren't reliable, then how can we reliably say that we should believe that evolution is true? Why can't we say that these cognitive faculties undermine our confidence in the theory of evolution, or even science in general, for that matter?
Yes, that is exactly what Plantinga wants to say. And, I haven't gotten a response from him directly to my paper, but, I mean, he basically spells that out in his initial argument in Is Naturalism Irrational? And what I want to say to that is that, no, our faculties aren't all that reliable, but reliability comes in degrees, and it is topic-specific. So, we're more reliable at some things than others. It seems that, if you look at a coin on the table, you can pretty reliably tell whether you're seeing heads or tails, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the more complex the task and the more emotion we have invested in it, the more various biases start to creep into our thinking. And so, we can very easily tell whether a coin is heads or tails, or whether a light is green, red, or yellow. But when it comes to evaluating evidence as to whether capital punishment is a deterrent for murder, it turns out that the best predictor of how we will evaluate any given piece of evidence is what our prior conviction happens to be on the subject.
Right.
Chances are we're not going to change our mind when we find conflicting evidence. In fact, conflicting evidence is going to make us even believe more deeply in what we already happen to believe, whichever side of the fence we were on.
Right. So if we were trying to do something like, say, determine when the world is going to end through biblical analysis, it would seem that our faculties aren't terribly reliable in that regard.
Yeah. Well, most people I knew pretty much got that one right. But there's another thing I wanted to follow up on with the reliability issue, and that is that individually we tend to not be very reliable, particularly when it comes to abstract theoretical questions, scientific questions, philosophical questions. It gets a little bit better when you get to large groups of people, but even then, people once believed the Earth was flat. People once believed that the stars were on a celestial sphere rotating around the Earth. So this is why science becomes so important, because it gives us a way to actually put questions to nature and get feedback, and we find out things like, oh, well, we thought this was going to happen, and it didn't, so something's got to change. So you can't really count on the reliability of a person, or necessarily even a group of people, but over time, we do weed out bad answers, and that gets us to better answers. And I think there's still maybe a bit of a self-referential problem in there, in the sense of, well, I'm just an individual. How do I know this? How can I reliably conclude anything? And that's really a difficult question to answer. I think ultimately it comes down to, well, I could be wrong, but this is what makes sense to me. This is my reasoning, so, go over it and look at the evidence and see what conclusion you come to.
Right. And I think
By the way, if anybody wants to look at this more closely, my paper is called "What's Wrong with the Evolutionary Argument of Naturalism?" And I wish it was available for free online, but unfortunately it's not. I think if you have a subscription to SpringerLink, you might be able to get it.
And what's the journal?
I can't even download a copy myself. It's kind of sad. But it's in the International Journal for the Philosophy of Religion.
And so while we're on that topic, you sent me this link to this article, which I started to read but wasn't able to get through. The one, the full title of it, crap. Damn it, I thought I had
the religious congruence one?
Yeah, the religious congruence one. So it seemed to me that the basic gist of the article was saying that too often when we study religion, attempt to study religion scientifically, we just assume that what people profess to believe is what they actually believe, and that really frequently messes with our understanding of how we should study religion. Is that sort of the gist of it?
Kind of, or to put it slightly differently, we ask people what they believe, and then we assume based on what they believe that there will be certain behavioral correspondences between the stated belief and what they actually do during their daily lives. And it turns out we find that there isn't nearly as much correspondence between those two things as we might expect to find. I was actually hoping to brush up on this stuff before we got started chatting, but we ended up spending so much time trying to get my microphone working unsuccessfully that I did not get around to it, unfortunately.
Right.
But that's the basic idea. And it's not just a problem for religion. I think it's really it's a problem for cognition generally. We have all these things we believe about various matters in religion, philosophy, and our daily lives. And our behavior doesn't always correspond to what one would predict just based on those beliefs. So it's a bit of a mystery. And the author was claiming that this sometimes undermines the interpretations that scientists studying religion make of their studies. They will ask people questions about what they believe and then draw conclusions just based on that. And the author was arguing that, well, no, you can't really draw those conclusions so readily. That's actually a fallacy.
Right, and it seems pretty fallacious for me too. And I think you're right, and it does seem like it's going to be an issue for more than just religion. I'd mentioned to you last night when we sort of prepped a little bit. Probably the extreme case of this is one of the patients of V.S. Ramachandran, who was a split brain case. He had his corpus callosum severed, so the left hemisphere of his brain and the right hemisphere of his brain actually couldn't communicate with each other. And when that happens, you can actually interrogate one half of the brain separate from the other half of the brain. And they asked...
It's called a commissurotomy, by the way. They usually do that. They sever the corpus callosum in epileptic patients because what will happen is something will happen on one side of the brain that causes it goes across the corpus callosum to the other side and then keeps going back and forth in a chain reaction. And that's basically an epileptic seizure. So they found that what they can do is just cut the corpus callosum, and that sort of stops the whole process in its tracks.
Mm-hmm. So they cut that to prevent the seizures. So it's obviously for medical reasons, not just for the purpose of experimenting. And then you can interrogate one half independent of the other. And so Ramachandran asked the left half of this guy's brain if he believed in God, and the left half said yes. He asked the right half of his brain if he believed in God, and he said no. And Ramachandran pointed out this creates some serious theological consequences. What happens when this guy dies? Does the left half of his hemisphere go to heaven and the right half go to hell? This is something that theological scholars have not really reconciled, I think. But like I said, that's an extreme case, but it also seems to me to be fairly reflective. I think, you'll probably agree with this, I think, but my general impression is that the evidence seems to suggest that most people are kind of hypocrites in this regard, not just sort of in the lay sense, but in a very, very technical sense, in that parts of their brain believe certain things and are committed to certain things, and other parts of their brain aren't committed to those things and don't believe those things. And so the illusion that we have sort of a single unified consciousness really is something that needs to be gotten over, and we need to have a better understanding of precisely what it is we're talking about when we talk about, for example, belief.
Yes. Yes, I think what's happening there is, well, one way to look at it is you have conscious verbal thinking, which is a sort of, we can call it a module or a circuit in the brain, and it's doing its thing, and it has some connections to the other parts of the brain, maybe less if you happen to have your corpus callosum severed, but your brain has all these different modules that come from different periods in our evolutionary history. For example, the top of the brainstem, that area around there, that's very evolutionarily old. We have like the amygdala in there and a lot of other components that are crucial for processing emotional responses and behavior. And then you have the cortex, which is more modern, more of a mammalian type thing. And anyway, you have all these different brain modules that, in a sense, have their own agendas and their own drives. And Daniel Dennett has called this a tug of war in the brain. I'm not sure if I'm using that exactly the way he uses it, but that's sort of the idea. You have all these different brain lumps that have their own drives and agendas, and then conscious verbal reasoning is our way of communicating with the outside world, or one of the main ways anyway. So that sort of takes these and it maybe synthesizes them, or maybe it has its own drives and agendas. And you don't always get a coherent product because you have all these different competing things.
Right. So what then do you make of this apparent illusion that we, the sort of the Cartesian illusion that we have sort of just incorrigible access to ourselves and to our beliefs, and that I know what I believe? I mean, do you think is that largely cultural? Is that something that's an evolutionary product in your opinion? What do you make of that?
That's a good question. Boy. Off the top of my head, I guess my guess would be that conscious awareness kind of unifies, in a sense, all of these different goings-on in the brain. And that's what we have access to through introspection, and that's what we present to others. So in a way, it feels probably more unified than it is, because I think we're trying to construct a coherent narrative. It's not really a sufficient answer to your question. I mean, it may have both evolutionary and cultural components. I think probably the way our brains are set up by evolution, there is a natural temptation to see the brain this way through common sense, to think that it's all sort of one coherent stream of thought. And our introspection somewhat reinforces that. But I also think that by coming to a more sophisticated and more empirically grounded understanding of how the brain actually works, we can begin to reconfigure our intuitions about these things. And this is maybe something that you and I don't entirely see in the same light, but I'm optimistic about the ability to retrain intuition to be able to see things a different way based on science. Like, I guess an example would be, intuitively, we're very prone to seeing the sun is rotating around the Earth. But once we learn a bit of astronomy, we realize the Earth is rotating on its axis and revolving around the sun. And then we can learn to understand the sunset as mostly relating to the motion of the Earth. Mm-hmm. And it still kind of looks like, like the sun is setting, like we're just sitting still. But we understand that that's an illusion. And I think maybe the same thing can happen with the brain. Once we see that we have all these different areas of the brain that do different things, that come from different evolutionary periods, we might actually be able to somewhat internalize that idea and incorporate it into our everyday psychology.
Right, and I mean, to that example, the story about Ludwig Wittgenstein, right, and his response to the Earth moving issue.
No.
I want to think this in the Philosophical Investigations. I think it was. He asked someone, it might have been A.J. Ayer, why it was that people were so reluctant to believe that the Earth was moving. And the interlocutor's response was, well, I guess because it just feels like it's standing still. To which Wittgenstein replied, right, but what would it feel like if it were standing still? I mean, as opposed to actually moving. It's something that he simply didn't share that intuition. Again, maybe that's because he was just a freaking genius, or maybe because he just had the right education to put him in the mindset to just see past it right away. But I actually have come more around to your side of thinking on this. I am actually a little bit more optimistic that we will be able to retrain our intuitions and our sort of common sense ways of thinking about consciousness and various related phenomena in light of science. But that was why I asked you the question about sort of evolution versus culture, the sort of nature nurture issue about this, because if it is hardwired into the brain in some way, then we might not ever be able to overcome these sort of this cognitive tug of war, to use Dannett's terms.
Right.
And if that's the case, then we might just be screwed. We might be condemned to never understanding ourselves in the way that we want to, which would kind of suck because
that's definitely a possibility, and there may be some hard limit, but I think at the very least it's not obvious that we have reached that hard limit. And I think the history of psychology does show us some examples of where we've really been able to reconfigure our own intuitive view of the workings of our own minds. For example, nowadays, it's just common knowledge. The man on the street knows that we have unconscious processes going on in our brains. But that idea, as far as I know, wasn't really around before Freud.
Right. I mean, it's certainly
not
in the explicit sense, but I mean, the Greeks did have a hint at it. They had talked about, inspiration coming from the muses and stuff like that, which is sort of a proxy for unconscious ideas. Yeah, and Schopenhauer, Origin of Species, is mentioning Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer actually had a pretty good grasp of the subconscious before Freud.
That's interesting. I'll have to look into that more.
But I think you're right. That certainly Freud is the one who popularized it. And Freud's the one who really brought it to the forefront of the popular consciousness.
And it's really taken off since then, because Freud had his view of the subconscious, which is nowadays would be extremely controversial, if not to say, a lot of the relevant experts would say, no, Freud was just dead fucking wrong about almost everything.
Right.
Maybe that's going too far, but nowadays there is a view that's of the neuroscientifically informed that something like, and this is sort of a fake precision thing, but something like 75, 80, 85% of all of what the brain does is really unconscious. They say that consciousness is basically the tip of the iceberg, and we just have this very thin slice of awareness. Underneath that, there's a huge iceberg of unconscious processes that thankfully regulate themselves. I mean, imagine how long we would last if we had to consciously remember to breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, keep the heart beating, keep the digestion flowing, and all that stuff.
So thank goodness we have subconscious and subcortical processes to take care of a lot of that stuff.
Yeah. And then, of course, a lot of what we think of as the more bona fide cognition is also unconscious biases that we don't really know we have. One of my favorite experiments from, I forget when it was from, but a group of researchers tried to see what kind of response they could get to an unconscious smell stimulus. So what they did is they brought in their subjects and had them fill out a questionnaire in a little booth. And then afterwards they'd be taken into another room and they would eat a biscuit. And half of the subjects had they sprayed a little bit of this lemon cleaning solution maybe in a bucket or something. It was somewhere out of view. None of the subjects noticed it in this booth where they're filling out the questionnaire, right? So half of them got it. And then they filmed the people later eating the biscuits. And the people who had sat in the booth with the lemon cleaning solution were much more likely to engage in cleaning behavior as they were eating the biscuit. Because it was a crumbly biscuit. It was flaking all over the place as they ate it. And the ones that it smelled this cleaning formula were like compulsively cleaning up after themselves, and the ones who hadn't were just kind of like, fuck it,
Mm-hmm.
I don't have to clean this up.
Yeah,
so that's just one example of how something that's unconscious can really influence your overt behavior.
And I don't want to just sit around trading experiments, but another one along the same lines that I heard about recently, which was pretty interesting. They gave half the subjects a card with a smell on it. And they primed them with the word Parmesan cheese, and the people who are primed with Parmesan cheese generally like the smell. And they had another group, they primed them with the word vomit. Exact same smell, those people thought that smell was disgusting. So same smell, just two different primes, and neither of the groups recognized that was the determining factor for them, what the words they were primed with. Yeah, so
Wow, that's great.
yeah, and an awful lot of evidence out there that suggests that we're pretty poor at accessing what's really going on in our minds. And that brings me as a segue to the next thing I was going to talk about. Now,
Yeah, I think those are both cases in point to your argument you brought up earlier about the reliability of introspection.
Exactly.
It turns out it's really not that reliable after all.
And that is the point that I wanted to segue into, because I mentioned to you last night, my friend HonestDiscussioner, who was on this chat right before I was, and I guess he's going to be on again right afterwards. He's the one who invited me into this. He drew to my attention, or drew my attention to this Christian guy on YouTube. He describes himself as a retired physicist and now a full-time philosopher. He's a Christian, and he's trying to argue for a peculiar form of dualism and against naturalism and materialism.
Okay.
And many of his arguments, again, in the little bits that I saw in the exchanges, the two videos of his that I watched, and in the chat that I had with him, some fairly typical stuff in there. But one of the things that I did find interesting about it was he was throwing out this the idea that the sort of Freudian revolution, that introspection is unreliable. He says that's a move that's done on behalf of naturalists in order to sort of bolster their case for naturalism. And of course, Freud was a materialist and an atheist, and so that sort of played into a sense.
I guess so, but there sure is a whole buttload of data out there concerning that.
Yeah, and he argued that the psychokinetic research proves that we can have an influence on the world through our consciousness and stuff like that. And
psychokinetic research? You mean like moving objects with your mind without touching them?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think the research he was pointing to specifically was random number generators. That if you got people to focus on random number generators, you can push them slightly one way or another.
That's so much less interesting than if someone could push a book of matches across a desk with their mind. That's what I want to see. Really, that would be the knockdown. Okay, we're wrong about a lot of stuff here. What's going on?
I mean, properly controlled, that would be impressive. Obviously, my first thoughts would be it's a con. There's magnets or something like that going on. But assuming that you could rule out those other sort of explanations, that would be some pretty impressive findings right there. But at the same time, I can at least, I think there is something to be said for in principle, if these sort of random number generators could do this. I'm going to pause here quickly because I do want to give a shout out now to the actual the cause. This whole live stream actually is dedicated to as a fundraising opportunity for the Military Religious Freedom Foundation. It is an important cause. I think there should be links around here somewhere for more information. And if anyone watching wants to donate, it is important to at least mention that. So I did want to pause for a break to plug that really quickly. Anyway, back to the thread of where we were. Part of this guy's argument.
Sorry, go ahead.
Part of this guy's argument was that it's sort of again the hard problem of consciousness from Chalmers. The idea that a naturalistic point of view can never ever account for consciousness as in the sort of subjective phenomenological way, in the richness and the intentionality and the subjectivity and the feelings of for example, seeing the color red. It can break that stuff down into sort of quantitative numbers about wavelengths of light and neural firings in the brain, but it can never actually capture and account for the subjective part of the experience. And because we know this subjective experience is real, therefore naturalism must be at best an incomplete philosophy of incomplete theory of the world. I don't know. Did you want to comment on that so far, or?
Yeah, I guess my first sort of knee-jerk reaction to it is, suppose it's true that naturalism cannot account for conscious awareness and experience and qualia and all those good things that we know and love. Does it follow from that dualism can?
Yeah, that's certainly, I think.
I'm sure it does.
I'm not sure it can, but I can at least sort of imagine how the argument would try to be played out. It would be something along the lines of, well, we have, the guy made the argument in a private message to me that we have sort of first-person experiences of our free will. So he might also make the argument that we have first-person experiences again of our conscious phenomena and stuff like that. So we know, again, from a first-person subjective point of view, that these sorts of conscious experiences are going on. So a sort of phenomenological approach that starts with just sort of taking our conscious experiences for granted as real is going to be the way to start. And since naturalism, has to reduce everything to quantity rather than quality, it can't. So a dualistic approach would be something along the lines of apparently Truth Addict is saying there was a 6.1 quake in New Zealand. And it's only, 12 hours later, whatever, something like that. But
oh, wow. 6.1 is pretty big.
Relatively big, yeah. You were at Loma Prieta, right, back in '89? You were in the Bay Area when that happened?
No, I wasn't. I was down in L.A.
Oh, you're down in L.A.? Okay. Were you in L.A. for the one that happened in L.A. a few years after that? Was it the '94 one or whatever it was?
I was in L.A. for one that happened in, I want to say, like, maybe 87, or maybe that was the one in 89, and I actually felt it there. I don't remember when it was exactly, but there was one down there that was great where the walls in the house were just waving. They were just, I was like, wow, walls can do that?
Yeah. I was in the Bay Area for '89 for the Loma Prieta quake, and I remember being thrilled. I mean, obviously it's a dangerous thing, and people got hurt and stuff like that. So it's not something you want to rejoice in. But it was a pretty amazing experience. Something I had never really experienced an earthquake that large before. And again, phenomenologically, it felt really weird. And again, to sort of try to steer this back into our previous conversation, the idea would be that while science can sort of give us again a numerical analysis of scales of earthquakes, and they can maybe say something about what firings go on in the brain when a person experiences an earthquake, they can never tell you what it's like. It can never explain scientifically the feeling of living through an earthquake. That's something that you just sort of have to go through.
Yeah, and I think, well, in a sense, I sort of agree with that, but I also think it's not the job of science to tell us what things are like. To know what it's really like firsthand, to be in an earthquake, you have to actually be in an earthquake firsthand. What science wants to do is explain these things and potentially help us predict them, and who knows, maybe someday control them. That's what science is trying to do. But, it's not going to give you the experience of flying on an airplane if you've never flown on an airplane. Just as you can show people pictures of Iraq, but that doesn't give them the experience of actually being in Iraq. There's something that's different about the first-person perspective, and I don't think that's actually a point in favor of dualism so much as it's just a fact about first-person experience and about what science can and can't do. But
right.
That's not to say that science could never explain why we have conscious awareness or why we have a first-person perspective. I think that's what science wants to do, is explain these things. And even though it can't convey the sense of what it's like in the same way that actually having the experience would convey it to you immediately, I think that's asking science to do that is the wrong thing. It's the wrong sort of task to ask science.
But again, playing devil's advocate here, doesn't that suggest that the sort of naturalistic science is incomplete then? Because here's this whole sphere of reality, which we all know is real, that science can't really account to, address, explain, touch, however you want to phrase it.
Well, if science can't explain it, then we would have to grant that point. My view on this is I think science potentially can explain it, but explaining it does not suffice for giving the experience. Those are two different things. I can explain the mechanics of automobile travel, but you will never know what it's like until you've actually ridden around in a car. But that's not a criticism of the science of automobile travel. That's just the nature of the causal situation. You have to be in a certain causal relationship with the world to have the experience. In other words, you have to be inside the car. No amount of explaining is going to put your ass in that seat. But that's not really what we want science to do. We just want science to explain it.
Right.
And I think science actually has made some inroads to explaining qualia and the hard problem of consciousness and all that. Maybe that's going too far. Maybe I need to qualify that more, because it's definitely an unsolved mystery at this point. It's maybe one of the biggest questions in science right now. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether it's actually harder than other problems. There are a lot of unsolved problems in neuroscience. We don't even entirely understand how neurons code information. all the different kinds of memory the brain uses. There are a lot of open questions. This was one of them. It might turn out to be harder than the others, but at this point we're to some degree speculating based on our ignorance, I think.
Mm-hmm. Again, quick pause. Apparently there's a volcano that erupted in Iceland, which is really not all that surprising considering how Iceland is basically just a giant volcano itself. I just saw that headline. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, yeah. Now, again, HonestDiscussioner, I think, did something really cool in his exchange with this guy, because this guy did mention Chalmers. This guy had claimed that Chalmers says that we've made no progress at all on the hard problem of consciousness. So HD actually emailed Chalmers, and Chalmers got back to him, and Chalmers said,
nice.
"Yeah, exactly." So I thought it was kind of cool on Chalmers' part too to just respond to a random email. But Chalmers said, "I never made the claim that we haven't made any progress. Maybe we made some progress at the fringes, but certainly the core problem is intact." But yeah, and again, as HD pointed out, given the fact that really neuroscience as a sort of genuine scientific discipline is only maybe a good 60 years old tops, it's really not all that surprising that we haven't, we've only been chipping away at the fringes.
Right.
So, I mean, we were talking a little bit last night about some experiments that do appear to try to take qualia seriously and give us sort of scientific accounts of qualia. I can't remember. I think you mentioned something about one from Paul Churchland's recent book or something like that, was it?
Yeah, in his most recent book, Neurophilosophy at Work, he has a chapter called Chimerical Colors, Some Phenomenological Predictions from Cognitive Neuroscience. And so he's actually making an earnest effort here to try to give a scientific account of color qualia. And whether he succeeds is difficult to say, but I'll tell you a little bit about what he says. He takes this idea that's been in literature for a while. There's something called the Hurwitz-Jameson Opponent Process Network. It's an account of color space, and the way it works is, let's see. This is another thing I wanted to brush up on before we talked, but I didn't get around to it, so I'm kind of flipping through the book now. But the idea is, the way we process color is we have three kinds of color cells. We have one that's a blue versus yellow, one that's a red versus green, and another that's a white versus black. And any kind of color that we see activates these cells in a certain proportion. It'll activate the blue versus yellow one so much. I think if I can recall, the way it works is they start at about 50%, and then like a blue stimulus would bias the blue versus yellow one in favor of the blue direction. Anyway, you can map reflectance color space onto these opponent cells, and what you get is this lopsided color cone, where all the colors we can see are represented in this cone, in this color space. And so he takes that, and is that clear so far? Is that making any sense?
It makes sense to me. I don't know if it's making sense to everybody else, but I think I've got it.
Okay, I hope I'm getting the details right. I'm kind of winging it a little bit here because it's not fresh in my memory. But basically the idea is, what's interesting about this is it makes some testable predictions. And what they are is, if this model is correct, there should be certain things we can see, but that are not ever activated by stimuli coming in to the eyes and to the visual cortex. What that means is we get after images. So if you look at the famous one, is there's one with an American flag. I think it's brown and green and maybe orange or something, and you stare at that for a while, and then you look at a white wall or a white piece of paper, and you see a red, white, and blue American flag. That's the after image. And the idea is that these opponent cells, the blue, yellow, red, green, and black, white, they've been so overactivated by that stimulus from staring at it for 30 seconds or so that they have sort of down-regulated their activity. And then when you look away from it, they're still in that biased state. So, the blue-yellow cell is no longer at 50-50. It's biased back toward the yellow end of the spectrum because it's been hit by a strong blue stimulus for so long. So then you look away, and now you're seeing a yellow stimulus on on that cell. Correspondingly with the green one, you're looking at the green stripes, and you look away from those, and suddenly they're red. And then you had black stripes on the flag. That's what the other color was. And you look away from that, and you get white, and then you get a red, white, and blue flag. And this has been known forever, so this is not the prediction itself. But what's interesting is you can, if you stare at some of these colors long enough, you can get an after image that is, it's this self-luminescent color that's brighter than anything we actually see out in the world. So, and you can do it on various backgrounds, and you start seeing these colors that are like glowing. The book actually has these color diagrams, and they have little dots you stare at, and then you stare at them for 30 seconds, and then you look over at the target surface, and it predicts what the after image is that you're going to see. So what's interesting about this is it's actually making a phenomenological prediction based on an empirical theory. So this is telling you something you're going to experience
that you've never experienced before. Yeah, that's pretty trippy right there, I think.
Yeah.
And I take it that prediction bared out to be correct, right? And generally does.
Yeah. Yeah, and there may be criticism of this argument in the literature. I haven't really followed up on it, but that's the basic idea. And so, yeah, you see these really bright, glowing, self-luminescent after images that are not quite like what you would see. I guess the closest thing to the world that you would see in a normal world is like something glowing like neon, or maybe the sun isn't a good example. I guess a neon sign is probably the closest thing. You see these ridiculously bright orange colors.
Right.
So, I mean, I think that's sort of a counterpoint to those who would say that these empirical theories, they aren't really connecting with the subjective experience of conscious awareness. In this case, they're aware of, well, yeah, they kind of are. And I think opponents of naturalism, like Chalmers and like the poster you were talking about, might come back with something like, well, okay, you predicted that they're going to have this experience, but you're still not really explaining why the experience is accompanied by an inner feel,
mm-hmm.
or why it's accompanied by a coil. Why isn't this just so much empty data crunching of the type that presumably a desktop computer does? Why does it feel like something when we do it? And I'm not sure. I mean, these experiments don't answer that question. That's obviously the hard problem of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
But they are at least making inroads into the world of experience. And it becomes kind of unclear when we're touching on that problem, the hard problem of consciousness, and when we're not, because consciousness is not very well defined. I mean, at this point, it can't be. We know that it's awareness. We can think about some of its properties and its qualities and what it does, but ultimately, there's very much a risk of over-defining something that we really don't understand. I mean, it's sort of as if someone in ancient Greece were defining water. Okay, water is that wet stuff that's in oceans and streams and rivers and falls from the sky occasionally. Well, now we know that it's one hydrogen atom and two oxygen atoms, and that's a much more robust definition. So I think that's sort of where we are with respect to consciousness, where, yeah, it's that wet stuff, it's that stuff that feels like something. But, we're making inroads on it. There was another, never mind, I think the theory of consciousness that's interested me the most is one that Paul Churchland proposes in his previous book called The Engine of Reason, The Seat of the Soul. I don't remember if I've talked to you about this. But actually, before I go on to that, did you want to interject anything else about the stuff on colors and qualia?
Well, no, I mean, I'm trying to sort of soak it all in and absorb it all. It's really interesting stuff. I do want to sort of interject one other thing here. I think at least one person here has in the chat has been asking you if you have a YouTube channel, which I think is an endorsement. The people seem to like what you're saying, so they want you to be making YouTube videos. I've been encouraging him to try to get to set up a YouTube channel for a while, so he can share this sort of stuff. Everybody.
I don't actually have one right now, and I haven't been following the chat because this is my first time doing anything of this sort, and that's just too much multitasking right now. I have enough trouble following my own train of thought and keeping up with what you're saying.
Right, yeah.
But I appreciate the endorsement. I'll think about that. I tend to post on Reddit a lot under the username Anomalous Visions.
And he also makes
Yeah,
music
Paul,
under that. If you want to check out his, do you have what's the web page where you do your music?
Facebook.com/AnomalousVisions is where I actually have music posted, and I have registered AnomalousVisions.com, but I haven't gotten around to actually designing the page yet.
Right. So if any of you guys
anything about web design,
if you guys like metal, you should totally check it out. I'm actually going to be using some of his music and some of my my videos coming up. He records his own stuff. It's some pretty sweet stuff. I think you guys will like it. Okay, but anyway, now back to Churchland's second most recent book. You were saying?
Yeah, he gives a theory of consciousness in The Engine of Reason, and I find it very interesting. I don't know if it's right. He doesn't even say that he knows that it's right. I mean, he fully admits that it's a speculative account, but it's got a fair bit going for it. It's based on recurrent neural network research and some research on neuroanatomy from the neuroscientist Rodolfo Linas. And basically the idea is this. Let's see, boy, how to explain neural networks without diagrams? Well, I've never had to do this without a diagram. It's so much easier when you can draw it on a chalkboard or something.
Right.
So you have this network of neuron-like entities, call them nodes. And say a simple one might have just a couple of input nodes, a few hidden nodes, and a couple output nodes. So it takes an input. You connect it to whatever. You can connect it to a microphone and have it do like speech or text-to-speech, make it read stuff off a page and then translate that into verbal speech out of a speech synthesizer.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to take more than that's going to be a complex neural network. That's going to take more than a handful of nodes. But you can do stuff like face recognition. You hook it up to a scanner and scan people's faces in, and it will tell you whether it's a male or female face. There was one made by Jerry Cottrell down at UCSD that did this, and it did male versus female faces. When you take off all the cultural cues, earrings, hair, all that, it distinguishes faces, male from female faces, as something like it was 88 or 89%, I think, which is about as well as humans do.
I'm sorry, quick pause there. Did you just say there's a neuroscientist at UCSD by the name of Jerry Cantrell?
Cottrell.
Oh, Cottrell. Okay, because Jerry Cantrell is the guitarist and vocalist for Alice in Chains, and like, wow, that guy really is multi-talented.
I think it's Jerry. I hope I didn't just say that because I got confused with the Alice in Chains guitar. Anyway, another one is you can somebody made a network that could distinguish echoes coming in from it was on a submarine, and it could tell the difference between a sonar echo bouncing off a rock and one bouncing off a mine, to steer clear of the mines. And the network actually did far better than humans do at that task. Anyway, one of the things that's really interesting about neural networks is they don't really have any sort of programming language. They aren't crunching lines of code. The way you make them work is you start giving them inputs and you train them. At first, the output is going to be complete garbage, but over time, you just correct their connection weights between the nodes a little bit each time it gets it wrong. And then eventually you get it to the point where the network is performing very well. And then you can start showing new examples outside the training set that it's never seen before. New mine echoes or rock echoes it's never heard before, new faces it's never seen before. And it'll say, oh, that's a rock echo. Oh, that's a male face. Or, this page of text says to be or not to be. And let's see. What else do I need to say to begin to establish? Oh, yeah. So was somebody developed, it might have been Jeff Ellman down at UCSD, but I'm not 100% sure, the idea of a recurrent network. He at least developed one type. And what that is you have your input layer, your hidden layer, and your output layer. He wired the hidden layer to an extra hidden layer. So in the middle of the network, between the input and output, you have a feedback loop. And the hidden layer, or the secondary hidden layer, is constantly feeding the last state of the network back into the first hidden layer. So what that does is it gives the network a form of short-term memory. It can actually do things in time. With just one layer, you can do simple tasks, or you can do tasks that don't require a time component, like, oh, okay, that's a male face, or that's a rock echo.
Mm-hmm.
But once you get the hidden layer, you can start doing things. The network can start processing data that's unfolding over time. Like, for example, that looks like the gait of a cheetah versus that looks like the gait of an elephant. So it's a form of short-term memory. And one of the other things that's really interesting about all this is it's designed very much just based on how neurons work in the brain. There are some relevant differences. We haven't found the sorts of learning algorithms that the human brain has yet, but structurally they're very similar. They basically work like neurons with axons and dendrites. So with recurrent networks, you have this ability to have short-term memory, to keep track of stuff that's unfolding across time. And from there, let's just go to a little bit of neuroscience. Churchland points out there's this structure in the thalamus, which is just kind of it's a big lump that sits on top of the brainstem, and it's divided into subparts. There's a part called the intralaminar nucleus, or rather, there are a bunch of parts called intralaminar nuclei. He speaks of it in the singular just for simplicity. But the intralaminar nucleus has some really interesting properties. It has feedback connections to and from all the major parts of the cortex. So, it's sitting there kind of in the middle of the brain, and it's going to the frontal cortex, it's going to the visual cortex in the back, it's going to the motor cortex, and it has connections both to and from. So what Churchland suggests is that maybe this interlaminar nucleus is a sort of recurrent neural network that acts as a hub for consciousness in the brain. And there's some reasons to think this could be the case.
So if this turns out to be the case, then something like this might be a pretty serious way of cracking open the hard problem of consciousness.
Possibly, yeah. This is where the line gets fuzzy between the easy problem and the hard problem, because we're still talking about mechanisms, but it gets interesting because we're fleshing them out in more detail, and this isn't just raw neuroanatomy. We're talking about functional cognition here.
Mm-hmm.
So here's something that's curious about the interlaminar nucleus. If you lesion, it's one of those bilateral brain structures, a left half and a right half. If you lesion just one half of it, the patient loses all consciousness of one half of their body. You get hemi-neglect.
All right.
So, the person will be saying, oh yeah, this is my right arm and this is my right leg. And the doctor will say, well, what are those arms and legs on the other side? And the patient will say, what?
Yeah, that's not my arm.
Completely refuse to take ownership of half of their body, and they just seem to be completely unaware of what's going on over there. And if you lesion the whole interlaminar nucleus, you get an irreversible coma.
Whoa.
So those are some reasons to think that it might be heavily involved in consciousness. And there are more reasons as well. Consciousness, well, this is kind of putting together this account plus the stuff on recurrent neural networks. Consciousness has to involve short-term memory. We have the experience of stuff unfolding over a period of time. So a recurrent neural network seems like the right sort of computational device to handle that sort of computation. You have, and this is going to the interlaminar nucleus part, you have consciousness unifies all of the different sensory modalities. We don't experience, like, this person is seeing and this person is hearing and this person is tasting. No, if I'm seeing and hearing and tasting, I can do all this at the same time. And maybe the reason for this is because I have the interlaminar nucleus running all these feedback connections to all the different parts of the cortex and incorporating them into a single stream of consciousness. So
Descartes was wrong about the what the hell? Where did he say that the consciousness, the seat of consciousness, was again?
The pineal gland.
Yeah, pineal gland. Thank you. Yeah. So he was wrong about that. Maybe it was the what's the name of this new structure now?
The what? The intralaminar nucleus of the thalamus.
Intralaminar nucleus of the thalamus.
Intra.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it looks we have about 5 minutes left here, so I do want to try to sort of steer onto something else really quickly because Origin
I
is...
mention one more thing that's interesting about this account.
Sure.
It makes a testable prediction, and that is that I don't know if anybody has tested this since then because I believe this book is from 1995, but if this account is correct, then severing any of those connections between the interlaminar nucleus and the cortex should obliterate that function in consciousness. So if you were to cut the connection between the interlaminar nucleus and the visual cortex, the person should lose consciousness of visual stimuli.
And that's what
even
happens.
for all the other various aspects of our consciousness.
Right, and you don't know whether or not that actually happened when they tested it?
I don't know whether or not that's been tested.
Yeah, well, that certainly would be interesting to find out because, yeah, that would be a pretty clear example of a scientific predictions regarding phenomenological experience.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, but like I was saying, I do want to mention because Origin is Specious, one of the guys here in the chat room, asked me a question a long time ago. I think it's an interesting question, and I'm curious to get your take on it.
Yeah.
I know you said ethics isn't your specialty, but this is more of a psychology, moral psychology thing, I suppose. So you might be able to have some thoughts on it anyway. He was asking, do you think there's any relationship between studying ethics, presumably I think he means in an academic setting, and being a better person? Again, this is an ancient question. It goes back to days of Plato, and the old question: can virtue be taught? And so I'm curious if you have any ideas on that.
No, it's actually something I've wondered about for years, but I've never actually seen any research on it. I mean, I take it as an empirical question.
Right.
I'm not sure exactly how we would go about answering it empirically, because that's one of those things that might be difficult to nail down in the laboratory.
Well, I do know some data, again, certainly not decisive data, but Eric Schweisenbagel at UC Irvine, actually I think he just left Irvine, he's about to go to Australia, I think.
I know that name from somewhere. He has a blog, doesn't he?
Yes, he does, Splintered Mind. It's a very good one.
Yes.
And I've actually talked with him before. He's a really nice guy. He helped me out with some of the experimental philosophy work I'm doing. But he did an experiment, which is pretty interesting, at a couple of, I can't remember, it was a couple of different philosophy meetings where he compared philosophers who went to non-ethics talks from philosophers who went to ethics talks, and set up
He's measuring that kind of priming. Is it like an immediate, like they just came from an ethics talk, or like they have a tendency to go to ethics talks?
I think it was they just came from an ethics talk.
Okay, so it's a priming thing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's probably fair to assume that the philosophers who go to ethics talks are generally ones that have a professional interest in ethics, even if they're not necessarily specialists in ethics. But they no doubt will have studied ethics. They'll have taken classes in ethics, if not taught classes in ethics. Right. So I think it's a little bit stronger, perhaps, than just a priming thing. And then they set up a contrived situation where they did something like they did spill papers or something like that, and see whether or not they could get assistance, that sort of thing.
Oh, one of those.
Yeah.
Great.
And what they found was that on average, people who were attending ethics talks did no better than people who were attending other philosophy talks.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, so, and that sort of stuff, again, is obviously far from conclusive, and Schweitzer-Bagel doesn't suggest it is, but it was just sort of an interesting experiment. And I have seen more data, again, at least suggests that same idea, that people who specialize in ethics are not, on average, any more ethical people. But again, I think all this data is fairly tentative. At the same time, though, again, I don't want to contrast data with personal experience, because obviously that's a difficult thing. But I've had several of my students in my ethics classes come out, and obviously, at least in the short term, saying that they're much more conscious and much more aware of ethical issues. Several of them have, said that they want to at least try giving up eating meat. And I know several of them actually have succeeded for at least a couple of years with giving up eating meat. And so that suggests to me that it's at least possible to improve people's behavior and improve people's character, at least marginally for somewhat short periods of time. So I'm perhaps a little bit more optimistic than the limited data would suggest.
Yeah, I don't think we can draw too many conclusions based on those sorts of limited data. I mean, I think that's one of the big problems with interpreting science, is people see this big headline on a scientific article and they go, oh my God, they finally proved that blah. And then you actually read the article and it's like, oh, well, under these very strict conditions following this paradigm, and by the time you're at the end of it, you're like, oh, well, that's kind of tentative. And then the next study comes out that has a completely different finding, and it's like, well, why don't we just wait another 5 or 10 years and see what happens when the jury's in?
I'm sorry. I'm actually going to respond to XQT here. Just asked, are there any good programs in Texas? XQTX. I actually went to a grad school in Texas. I went to grad school at Rice University. I loved it there. I thought it was a great program. Another great program in Texas, UT Austin has a great program as well. So if you're looking at grad school in philosophy in Texas, those are probably, not to toot my horn, but those are probably the two best programs in the state of Texas, I guess. Austin's better than Rice, but Rice is still pretty good. Okay, we're at 6 o'clock now, but HonestDiscussioner is saying he actually wants us both to stick around, and he wants to possibly chat with both of us. I don't know, HD, if you're still around, if that's something that you want to do. I'm not sure exactly how we can make this work, though, because Jeff and I had difficulty figuring out how to get the call connected for him.
I wasn't able to get my computer working with Skype or Gmail chat for whatever reason. I wasn't finding the microphone no matter how hard I tried. So I'm just talking to Garrett over a cell phone right now.
Yeah, so that's a little confusing and a little frustrating, but I'm sure we can try to see if we can get a three-way conversation going on here. Okay, HD is calling me. Let's see if I can get that to work. Hey, HD, you there?
Yep.
Okay, hang on. I'm going to have to try to balance the volumes here.
You two guys in the other room. Can you still hear the other gentleman?
Jeff, you still there?
I'm still here. Yeah, I can hear you fairly well, but I can't hear the other callers so well.
How about now?
I can hear that there is sound happening, but it's kind of...
Yeah. I think using both the call program and Skype at the same time is creating some chaos.
You're not calling him through Skype, are you?
No, I'm calling him through I'm calling his cell phone through Gmail phone call.
Oh, okay. That is going to be a problem then.
So how about this? How about I sign off with Jeff, and then HD, you and I can have a short conversation. Will that work for you?
Well, I feel bad interrupting this. If you guys want to just go ahead and continue until you don't want to do that anymore, that's fine.
Jeff, what do you think?
That's fine.
Okay, all right. So
I heard what you said.
Yeah, we'll hand it back to HD in a little bit. We'll take at least a few more minutes here to continue our conversation.
Sure, I'll talk to you later.
Okay, right. All right. Okay. So yeah. So where were we, Jeff?
Where were we? We were talking about hard problem with consciousness and its neural correlates. And where do we segue to after that?
Okay, let's actually take that back to the field of religion. Now, I think possibly one of the things that is an interesting question, again, obviously in connection with the idea of artificial intelligence, and consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. Obviously, there's a feeling of what it's like to have a religious experience, to feel like you're communing with God or something like that. And if we can sort of crack that, if we can figure out exactly what's going on in the brain, I know there's some controversy both amongst neuroscientists and neurophilosophers and religious scholars as to whether or not that kind of sort of would demystify it, whether or not that would sort of prove these experiences are just sort of misfirings in the brain or something like that, and that they're not actually connecting in any way to a sort of deeper reality about God. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, the religious position on this, I don't know that it's necessarily falsifiable. You look at the evidence and you see stuff like, if a person is a temporal lobe epileptic, that makes it much, much, much more likely that they are going to have religious experiences. And that kind of sounds like, look, their neurons are misfiring, quote unquote. It's just the brain malfunctioning that's doing this, and that's certainly a tempting interpretation for anyone who's already a naturalist. But the religious person might just come back and say, temporal lobe epilepsy is just how God communicates with people. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how to disprove that.
But do you find it at all plausible? I mean, do you think that's a defensible line, or is that just desperate special pleading or something like that?
Well, it does sound a little desperate to me, although I'm not sure what sort of result would count in favor of the religious interpretation.
Well, what about then the flip side, which Squinny, I guess is this person's username, is bringing up? If we sort of eliminate religious experience that way, wouldn't we also eliminate love and happiness and other sorts of things which presumably naturalists want to hold on to?
Right, yeah, that's the other point. That's actually a good point. Yeah, I mean, if when I'm waiting for my Pop-Tart to pop up in the toaster, there's something in my brain that's creating that experience for me, and certainly finding its neural correlates does not refute the fact that there's a toaster with a Pop-Tart, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is that the religious cases seem to happen mainly when something is going wrong, like in the case of temporal lobe epilepsy.
Right. Well, but are we imposing a normativity on that then, which isn't really scientific at that point? I mean...
Oh, the idea that it's something wrong?
Yeah.
Probably.
I mean, maybe the temporal lobe epileptics are simply kind of like savants or people, or geniuses, right? I mean, they have exceptional brains. Some people have exceptional brains that allow them to do calculus really easily, or music at a grace. Maybe temporal lobe epilepsy is just like the genius level religious communicator.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what the side effects are, so to speak, if a neurological condition can be said to have side effects. I think Michael Persinger has a really interesting take on it. He's the guy who designed the God helmet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people were talking about that a little bit earlier in the chat room, the God helmet.
Yeah, the way he looks at it is he'll bring people into his lab, put the helmet on them, put them in a chair in a dark room, put ping pong balls over their eyes or dark glasses or something, a mask or something like that, and he'll just leave them alone, and a certain percentage of these people will have some sort of religious experience, or they will sense that there is a presence in the room or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he's been able to reproduce this a lot. I'm not sure to what extent other researchers have been able to reproduce his work. I've heard that some people have had trouble sort of reverse engineering his God helmet. But what I like is he asks, okay, so I've been able to produce these experiences in the laboratory in subjects. What are the conditions out in the wild that might lead to these experiences?
Mm-hmm.
We don't really know. Maybe magnetic fields, because that's what he's using. There are some people that speculate that magnetic fields by fault lines have something to do with why people have alien abduction experiences. So, there's just a lot we don't know. Another thing that we've found is that there's a part on the top of the brain, I want to say it's the parietal lobe, but I might be mistaken about that, but it's responsible for finding our body's boundaries in space-time and defining those.
Mm-hmm.
So when something goes wrong with that, you get out-of-body experience type phenomena. You can't locate your own body in space-time. You can't separate yourself from the rest of the universe. So you end up having experiences like, holy crap, all is one. Everything is God. I am God. The universe is God. I am experiencing everything.
Is there any relationship between that part of the brain and phantom limb syndrome?
That's a good question, and I am not sure. It seems like phantom limb syndrome has to be a case of having a map of the body that is not accurate to the body's actual limits. And I would guess that probably is what would be happening is the map of the body up in that part of the brain is probably still complete, but the body isn't.
Right.
But I'm just speculating. I'm not really that familiar with the research.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay. So then, again, bring back to the idea of sort of religious experience and whether or not we can sort of judge if there's a reality that's keying into. Mightn't something similar happen also with ethics? I mean, couldn't we possibly sort of decode the ethical portions of the brain in some way? And would that possibly somehow sort of undermine the validity of ethics? Could we then sort of have one of those nightmare scenarios that theists are always warning about? Oh, naturalistic atheism undermines ethics because all it is neurofirings in the brain, and we've got no normativity, no reason to care about human life and stuff like that.
Right. I tend to think not. I tend to think that normativity and description are not quite as separate as philosophers have typically taken them to be.
Mm-hmm.
I think because we can separate these in language and talk about them separately, we assume they are completely different things. There's a chasm between is and ought.
Right.
But researchers who are looking into neuroethics and how the brain processes this stuff have been finding that it looks as though facts come to us with values already attached.
And this brings us to Sam Harris, which is one of the other things that we were talking about.
Yeah, so the fact-value distinction doesn't seem to be as clean as it looked like it once might have been. Do you want to say anything about that? Because I know that's something you've looked into.
Yeah, I honestly started getting into it on the philosophical level before I heard about the neuroscience research. But when I heard about the neuroscience, again, that did suggest the brain doesn't really process facts and values all that differently. It certainly sort of would seem inclined to bolster my general thinking. This is one of the objections I have to Kant, actually, because Kant wants to say that we basically want to sort of distance our ethics from emotions as much as possible because they're unreliable. We want to base it on pure reason. But then, again, when you see how ethical thinking works in the brain, you realize that it's the emotional subsystems that are doing an awful lot of the work. To bring it back to this fact-value distinction.
That's really interesting that you bring that up, because I don't think you read her work on this, but Patricia Churchland said something very similar as a response to Kant quite a while ago. I think maybe back in the 80s or early 90s.
Really? Oh, I if you could find me a reference on that, I would be interested in checking out, because I have done some reading on neuroscience and Kant, which I've found quite interesting. But I don't believe
I'll have to do some serious Googling, because I think I read that back in 1993 or something.
Damn. But yeah, if you can find it to me, that'd be awesome. But yeah, I really like the way that Harris puts it, actually. He says that facts are a kind of value. Or was it the other way around? Values are a kind of, fact. I can't remember exactly which one. I might be conflating it. The idea for me, again, at least, I won't put this in Harris's mouth, but for me, what I think about it is that we have certain epistemic values. We care about things like coherence. We care about the idea that our values are consistent with or our beliefs are consistent with each other. That we care about whether or not this belief is compatible with the sort of best available evidence. We have to judge what the best available evidence is. All these things are value judgments, and that we can't really make sense of facts as we think about them, as we experience them, without building all these sorts of values into the conversation. So to speak of facts as if they were just completely divorced from values isn't really a coherent way of thinking about it, because that's not the way that we. It's not the way that we think. It's not the way that we work.
Right. So, can you come up with an example of that, of a fact that's sort of an ordinary fact, and how value has an influence on it?
Sure, I can come up with what's perhaps a kind of I hesitate to use this because I sometimes feel like it might be a question-begging example. But when I've asked people in the past, when we've been debating this, I say point to me to a fact that is not in any way value laden. And so they'll say something, to use the example you gave earlier, the coin on the table is heads up. That's a fact. That's purely factual. There's no values at all. And then again, my comeback, which again is kind of tongue-in-cheek. I'm not. This isn't like the deep version. It's just sort of a way of sort of trying to get you thinking. But you point to that fact because it has value to you, because it seems like a counterexample. So it has this epistemic value that you're pointing to, and because of that epistemic value, it's serving a purpose for you. And because it's serving a purpose for you, it's connecting to your consciousness in a way that's laden with all these values. So in a certain way, it might actually be conceptually impossible to point to a fact that has no value, because anytime you try to do that, you are appealing to a value. You're trying to say this has value for me in this argument. And so accordingly, again, they're going to say this is kind of a cheap shot. I don't mean this to be a sort of a knockdown argument by any sense of the matter, but it does sort of at least show a bit of a conceptual roadblock for thinking about how it is that values interact with facts and our perception of facts.
That sounds pretty reasonable to me. I guess maybe another way of putting the same point would be that if we don't have values, we can't even begin to point to a fact because, well, what are we pointing to and why?
Right. Yeah. Our epistemic values are going to dictate what we perceive to be facts, what we think about as facts. And obviously, we shouldn't conflate epistemic values with moral values. Those obviously are different kinds of things, but they are at least both values. They fall under this broad umbrella. And I think once we do get more comfortable with thinking about facts in that light, it's a lot less unscientific and a lot less uncomfortable to start thinking of the idea that science can address moral issues or issues of value more generally speaking.
Yeah.
Or did we just blow your mind?
We have some overlap action in the Venn diagram between fact and value.
Yeah. I actually used that diagram that you sent me in an earlier video I made called the messy objective-subjective distinction.
Yeah.
And I threw it up there in a conversation with Bionic Dance, who's another YouTuber who has interesting videos on this subject.
Yeah, and that's a related subject that we've talked about a bit in the past. And I'm not sure if it's exactly the same, the fact-value distinction versus the subjective-objective distinction, but they're definitely very related.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wonder about that myself sometimes. Exactly what the relationship between subject-object and fact-value is, because you're right. They don't seem to be identical. They don't seem to be synonymous, but they are very closely related.
Right, because subjective-objective seems to touch more on issues of conscious awareness. The subjective is it's emotional or it's something I'm experiencing, whereas fact-value seems to be, this is the way the world is versus this is how I feel about it.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that.
And Honest Discussioner is bringing up the point, it also comes into the idea, again, when we're talking about values, are we simply meaning things that individuals personally take to be valuable, or are we meaning to suggest that these values have some sort of universal bindingness that are sort of incumbent upon all rational beings, to use Kant's language?
Yeah, that is not a mode I am accustomed to thinking in, at least anymore.
Right.
I think maybe I thought about things more early on in studying philosophy, and as I went, my view just became more and more naturalistic and more about events transpiring in space-time as opposed to rational absolutes.
Right. So might this then sort of be a deflationary account then of value? I mean, if all we mean when we say science can speak about values is that it can describe the values that certain individuals hold. Okay, science can tell me that I hold these values, or that it might even tell me I hold values I didn't even realize that I had. But it can't in any way say that I ought to hold these values, or that these values are superior to other values.
What do you make of that?
Well, what do I make of that? I don't know. Again, it seems to me that, again, I'm fairly partial to Harris's take on this. I like the way he approaches it. He says, look, he makes a comparison to medicine, for example. Medicine has values built into it. There are certain facts about whether or not this person is healthy or unhealthy. Now, obviously, there's a lot of fuzziness going on, so there might be a certain degree of cultural relativity. Someone who's healthy in one culture might not be classified as healthy in another, depending on things like the level of technology and so forth. So there's obviously a lot of fuzziness, but at the same time,
but if you think empirical facts have no bearing on the question, then you're just high.
Yeah, obviously they do, and there are sort of poles. A corpse is pretty clearly on the far end of unhealthy, whereas a 20-year
condition.
Yeah, right, exactly, and then the other end might be like a 20-year-old who's been eating hypoallergenically grown foods or something like that, working out every day, very low bad cholesterol, high good cholesterol, all that sort of stuff.
George St. Pierre is what we're talking about here.
Yeah, fair enough. I don't know who that is, but I'll run with it as an example.
UFC middleweight champion.
Ah, gotcha. Okay.
Champion.
Yeah. So you have some pretty clear polar ends. You have healthy and you have unhealthy, and science has a lot of bearing on this. So it's he wants to say that something similar can be said of the question of whether or not, again, I'm going to use the virtue ethics language here, whether or not someone is flourishing. So some people pretty clearly live well, and some people pretty clearly live unwell, and science can sort of help us parse these out. Again, there will be lots of fuzzy areas, lots of overlap and lack of clarity. But if you compare someone, for example, who's anencephalic, for example, they're going to be someone who's pretty clearly not living, not flourishing. They are biologically a human being, but they are not living a flourishing human existence. By contrast, someone who is, let's say, sort of deeply in love, lots of strong friendships, healthy, physically speaking, psychologically speaking.
Has a YouTube channel.
Yeah, there you go. They are going to be, maybe not the paradigm of flourishing. That might be overstating it, but they're pretty clearly flourishing more than the anencephalic person is. And that's something that it seems like a common sense understanding, but I think also science can sort of pair that up pretty well.
Yeah, that certainly seems reasonable to me.
Sorry, I'm trying to catch up really quickly here on some of the comments in this section. Some people actually are engaging.
If I read that stuff, I will lose my train of thought on what you're saying.
Right, yeah, and it does take a certain degree of practice, I think, to balance the two, and I'm obviously far from adept at it, but all right, but anyway, okay, so yeah, so I think it does make sense to say that, again, I don't know if it might be wrong to say science can answer moral questions, but I certainly think that it can address them, it can clarify them, it can move us in directions that are better or possibly even worse if we're doing bad science or trying to address questions that we don't fully understand yet. We could be moved further away from good understandings of human flourishing.
One of the objections or criticisms of Sam Harris that I see over and over again on anywhere philosophers are involved is that Harris is just regurgitating stuff that philosophers have known since the dawn of time, and he isn't contributing anything new to the discussion. What do you make of that?
I've heard some very good complaints and very good criticisms of Harris's book. That one I don't think is one of them. It seems to me, actually, that what Harris is doing is something that is, at least in the mainstream of philosophy since Hume, to be fairly unpopular. Not unheard of. Again, he's not completely pioneering new ground. There are philosophers who have suggested the sorts of things that he's putting forward. But far from regurgitating what philosophers have known for hundreds of years, it seems to me like he's going against mainstream philosophical thought.
By saying that science can address these questions?
Yeah. Again, I think at least
that's almost certainly true. I mean, philosophers, a lot of them anyway, do not like to cede any ground to science. The neurophilosophy people got the same kinds of things. It's not as prevalent now. People are starting to get used to the idea that if you want to talk about the brain and about the mind and about cognition, you actually have to know something.
Yeah,
I mean, that was a shocking and radical idea when it was first proposed.
I've heard Patricia Churchland talk about the hostility that she encountered when she first started proposing this, and it frankly shocked me.
And I, believe it or not, I saw some of that in grad school in the 90s. I was down at UCSD studying under the Churchlands, and I would hear some of the things other grad students would say behind their backs, and I would just be shocked. I had one student say, Paul Churchland is just a shitty philosopher. He's just, here's this thing in science. I'm going to take this and use it and publish it in a philosophy article. Now I'm published. And it's like, really? You think people should just be trying to figure this stuff out from an armchair? How well has that worked for the last 2,000 years?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's worked somewhat well. I think armchair philosophy does have value. It does help us with some things. I mean, after all, armchair philosophy gave birth to empirical science. So I think there's a heritage and a lineage there. But yeah, I mean that fact alone, the fact that
there is a heritage.
Yeah, and
I mean, we seem to be hitting the wall. I think in terms of, for example, philosophy of mind.
Yeah, I mean, in certain fields, obviously, we need to be, I think, migrating into a more empirically informed ideas. But still, even in philosophy of mind, you are going to need to understand the neuroscience, but you don't need to be a neuroscientist. So there is still room for philosophy of mind in a way that's maybe obviously not completely independent from neuroscience. But it's not like we're going to start shutting down departments that specialize in philosophy of mind and just having everyone move into the neuroscience labs. There's still work to be done.
I agree completely.
And one of my teachers when I was an undergrad, Robert Cummins, who works in philosophy of mind, he had a great line that I've repeated a lot. He says, science is just philosophy that worked. And that's true of psychology. That's true of physics and natural philosophy, biology.
Does that mean that philosophy is science that doesn't work?
Yeah, I suppose that there's something.
Question.
It doesn't yet work. Doesn't yet work the way we would want it to. So it seems to me that again, as a professional philosopher, I am completely comfortable, not uncomfortable, but excited about the prospect that that a lot of these questions will migrate away from sort of just being located in philosophy departments and start making their way into neuroscience departments. That doesn't seem like a threat at all to me. It seems peculiarly territorial to argue that. To argue otherwise. So yeah, it just really baffles me.
Territorial is exactly the right word for what's going on there.
So yeah, I mean,
the old in-group benevolence, out-group hostility that we see through pretty much all of primate history.
Right, exactly. I mean, I'm working with an experimental economist right now at my university. I think I've mentioned that to you before, and I love the idea of interdisciplinary work, getting outside of my expertise and hearing his thoughts on things. That to me, I'll put it the way Patricia Churchland put it. She says, I want to understand how things work. I don't give a damn whether or not you classify it with this taxonomy or that taxonomy. You say it belongs in this department or that department. I want to understand the world. I want to understand the brain. I want to understand markets and economics. I want to understand all this stuff. And I don't care who's doing the work and where. If it's interesting and thought-provoking, whether it qualifies as philosophy or not, who gives a damn?
Yeah, exactly. I was just shocked at how many of the grad students, even as recently as the turn of the millennium, were just, horrified by this idea.
Someone's pointing out that Camping, the guy who is predicting the end of the world, his radio station and his website are offline. We should.
What he's saying.
Yeah, we should seriously start a betting pool on how long it's going to take him to make a public appearance, and then second off, what it is that the first line rationale is going to be, whether or not it's going to be, this was a test of our faith, or we averted the apocalypse, that whole bingo chart thing, the apocalypse bingo that I used in my video and that you mentioned. We should seriously start taking bets.
Yeah, and I loved your video, and I thought it was brilliant that you turned it around and showed how basically all of us in one way or another are guilty of the sort of cognitive dissonance that someone like Camping must surely be experiencing right now.
Yeah.
At the same time, I just can't help laugh at the guy. I can't do it.
Yeah. I'm not opposed to laughing at him. Per se, just so long as we make sure that we follow that up with, yeah, but okay, where have I committed a smaller but similar sort of epistemic sin, so to speak?
Yes. Yeah, your example of factory farming was perfect.
It's amazing because of the comments that I've gotten since I posted that video, whatever it was, like 18 hours ago, fully at least 50% of them were about the factory farming, even though that was about 2 minutes out of 7. So many people seem to jump to that topic. And again, it's weird because I don't want to say it's proving my point, but it certainly, I think, at least is supporting my point. People feel this cognitive dissonance. He's attacking me. He's saying I'm a bad person. Therefore, I have to defend myself. Because really, like, half the comments are on that. And there are, when I make a video on factory farming, I certainly don't mind addressing those comments. But it seems that like half the people completely ignored everything about cognitive dissonance and about sort of self-reflection and trying to be better at it ourselves. And they all they heard was that 2 minutes on factory farming.
Yeah, that's too bad.
Yeah, but again,
about the animal rights issue is it just really it's such a hot button issue. People just I don't know. Maybe that's an example of facts being value laden. How can you look at the fact of a pig, squealing, being flayed, and not have any sort of emotional reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean,
you either you're desensitized or maybe you're a psychopath. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, more than a couple of people, sort of responded to my video by saying, actually, I suppose I should probably say, in case those of you who are listening didn't see my video, here's a very, very, very brief summary of what I said in that video. The idea is that the psychological mechanism that people encounter when they do things like predict the end of the world and the end of the world doesn't come is called cognitive dissonance. And it's when we have two beliefs that sort of conflict with one another, but they're both beliefs that we're attached to. Like, for example, I'm a smart and responsible person versus I did a stupid and irresponsible thing by giving away all my money to that guy who said the world was going to end. And so this cognitive dissonance occurs when these two beliefs conflict, and we have to resolve it in some way. And frankly, it's just so painful to admit that we're stupid and irresponsible that we just convince ourselves that, no, I wasn't stupid and irresponsible, I did the right thing, even though the world didn't end in some way. And obviously, it's really easy to recognize it when other people, like Camping and his ilk, do it, but it turns out that almost everyone does this to some degree in some regards or another. We have our own cognitive dissonance. And so the takeaway moral of my story was that rather than just laughing at these people, again, I'm not opposed to laughing at them per se. I don't think we should laugh at them to their face, because if we laugh at them to their face, it actually pushes them more towards towards radicalization, to being less open to reality. But behind their backs, I got no problem laughing at them, so long as after we laugh.
That was the first time I've ever heard a justification of talking behind people's backs. That's great.
Oh, well, it's not hard. It's not that hard. Doctors do it all the time. Doctors, will say things to patients that they know, if they are informed of certain facts, will inhibit their recovery, for example, so they don't tell them things to their face, but they will talk to family members or to other doctors about them behind their back. So I don't think it's all that unusual. Called being polite, as Lisa is pointing out. So I think it is okay, again, in the privacy of non-believers to talk, to laugh behind their backs. But then what we have to do is we have to turn around and we have to say, okay, where am I doing the same thing? Where am I engaging in cognitive dissonance? And one of the examples that I gave was the fact that a lot of people seem to have cognitive dissonance about factory farming, because on the one hand, they like eating meat. They've been doing it since they were kids. They really enjoy it. They're used to it. It's a big part of our social life. But at the same time, they realize that, gosh, hurting animals kind of sucks, and factory farms does some pretty brutal things to people, or to animals and to people, too, the people who work there.
Can I interject very quickly?
Mm-hmm.
Going back to the theory of consciousness I was talking about earlier with the interlaminar nucleus and the recurrent neural network, if that model turns out to be correct, that's going to be a knockdown argument for consciousness in pretty much at least all mammals.
That is another interesting revelation.
They have the relevant neuroanatomy going on, so they're going to be effectively just about as consciously aware as we are. They just aren't going to be able to communicate it through language like we do.
Right. To me, that doesn't really require. No, I think that argument's already been knocked down just from the evolutionary argument and just other sort of broad-scale neural networks. But that certainly would be yet another nail in the coffin. But anyway, again, I find I have a lot of cognitive dissonance about a lot of things. Things that I want to believe are perfectly morally acceptable because it benefits me in some way. And the examples I used in the video were wearing factory farm clothing, wearing sweatshop clothing made in sweatshops, and using things like my
free range coffee.
Yeah, my utterly awesome iMac that I have here, which has got a pretty awful Apple's a pretty bad track record, environmentally speaking. I like to think of myself as an environmentalist. But at the same time, I engage in a lot of behavior which is pretty environmentally unfriendly. I know I'm doing it. I know I could be doing better. Most of the time, I just sort of sweep it under the rug. And I want to take opportunities like this to try and reflect on myself and improve and try to make my values more consistent with my behaviors and my beliefs. Yeah. Okay. So that was the summary of the video. I interrupted to give that summary because we were talking about something more about it. Remember what we were saying right before I gave that summary?
Oh, was it?
Oh yeah, you can't help laughing at them. So I'm not opposed to laughing. I mean, a lot of the images I showed, I think you actually posted on Facebook that picture of Jesus with a vacuum cleaner going, oh yeah.
It's just too funny, and the people have predicted the end of the world so many times now. It's not just something that started happening around the turn of the millennium. Obviously, they've been doing it for pretty much since before Jesus. There was a big one in, I believe it was the 15th century, where a lot of the Christian theologians and the astrologers had actually come to agree on a date, or at least a year, when it was going to end. There's supposed to be like a massive flood, and of course, none of this ever happened. But
yeah,
it's
again, like I said, their astounding inability to learn from history is something that really sticks out. Not just the fact that the Camping himself made a prediction and was wrong in '94, I think it was. That alone, again, should present some humility. But
so he hasn't been in the press at all today. He hasn't come out and made any kind of statement.
I don't know. That's just what I'm seeing in the chat. Someone was suggesting that. So yeah, I think we should start a betting pool on 3 items now. First off, how long it'll take him to resurface. Second, what his first line defense will be, and third, when his next prediction for the apocalypse will be. I mean, if between '94 and now, that's what, 15 years. Is it going to be another 15 years? You think when he makes his for the next prediction? Is the world going to end now 20? Is that 26? I guess what that would be. He might.
I don't think he'll be around.
Yeah, he probably won't be around. He is like 90 years old, but at the same time, he might live long enough to make the prediction, and his followers certainly will be still around. So it'll be interesting to see how they deal with it.
Yeah, what I'm hoping is that Camping turns out to be sort of a closet Popperian, and he's going to go, oh wow, the Bible guaranteed that on this date the world was going to end. We falsified that prediction. Okay, Bible's wrong.
Yeah, that is obviously the Popperian line of argument. But at the same time, again,
I would give that about a 0.00001 probability.
Yeah, but not even that. I think that there actually is some good rational basis for that. I mean, again, in actual science, we don't get falsification. Doesn't work that way. That's not the way science is actually practiced anymore. I mean, we perform 30 experiments expecting to get the result, not getting the result until finally we tweak it just right, and then we figure out, okay, that's what we did wrong. So the 30 failed experiments don't falsify the theory. It's at least a rationally viable move for people who believed in him to pull something similar. Now, granted, it was very ill-advised of them to say that the Bible guarantees it. If anything, they should say, okay, well, perhaps that was a mistake to say it guarantees it. But it seems like they still could rationally hold on to the idea that no, the Bible is reliable. We fucked up, that to say
we need to change our auxiliary assumption or our math or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Incidentally, do you know what Popper actually thought about that problem? Because I had thought that he was sort of endorsing this position that I guess some people would call naive falsificationism, not really taking into account the theoreticness of perception. But I've more recently had conversations with someone who's intimately familiar with Popper's work, and he said that no, Popper wasn't anywhere near that naive. He was putting forth falsification not as a sort of deductively certain, like, okay, this theory is definitely wrong, but as this is something we have to take into consideration, and we have to try to narrow down if some auxiliary assumption is wrong or if the theory is actually wrong. I was wondering if you knew more about that.
Yeah, my understanding is his ideas evolved over time. He started off fairly naive when he first forwarded it, but as these sorts of problems started to crop up, he started to revise his idea accordingly. And towards the end of his life, he ended up having a pretty rarefied view. He responded to so many criticisms and so many objections. He really had to put himself out on a limb. That's not the right expression. He had to. It's the death by 1,000 qualifications problem. He had to qualify it in so many ways that while it still made sense to him because he had just sort of taken one qualification at a time. If you put it forward to a reasonably informed, reasonably intelligent person for the first time, all these qualifications at once, it's too much baggage to really accept. But yeah, he did have a sophisticated falsificationism by the end of his life.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing happened to the positivists. It's almost the exact same pattern. They started off with a kind of a naive view, but powerful view, and then as the criticism started coming in, they started to revise it and revise it and revise it. And by the time you get to Quine, it's just so ridiculously overburdened, it's not worth it.
Would you consider Quine a positivist?
Oh no, not at all. Quine, I think Quine put the death nail in positivism. He was, in my mind, up there with Chomsky, with the people who just completely, finally put the lie to positivism.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I didn't think you were going to say Quine was a positivist. I'm not sure what to call him in that respect, other than a naturalist.
I think he's kind of a Quinean. He kind of sort of in a class all on his own, kind of like Wittgenstein. You know, just he's staked out his own territory, and other people join his camp.
Right. It's good to be one of those guys.
Yeah. Well, I think you actually quoted Paul Churchland to me once, a quote that I've always remembered. The trick to succeeding in philosophy isn't arguing with other people. It's getting other people to argue with you.
Yeah. Yeah, that about sums it up.
Yeah, that's wise words. Wise words. All right, we're at like 6:40 now. I think we've more than overstayed our welcome. I think it's probably best if we move on. Let HonestDiscussioner take over again.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. And good talking to you, man.
Yeah, I think we've had about 130, 150 viewers this whole time, so I presume that means people have been generally pretty pleased with what they've been hearing.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, so it's been great talking to you. I'm glad we're able to have a public conversation. You should take this again as encouragement to start a YouTube channel. You don't even need a video camera. You go to like Extra Normal or something like that. You can type in your own script and you can have animated characters do it for you. I think. I would certainly plug you on my channel. I know a lot of my subscribers and a lot of my friends would certainly dig the stuff that you do. So you should check it out.
Right on. Thanks for the tip.
Okay, so HonestDiscussioner is still around, so I think I'll see if he's ready to take over. Or also World Citizen, who I don't know who that is. They might be up next.
Well, I'll hang out until you've got somebody else on the line, just to make sure, so you're not hanging there talking to yourself.
Right. Okay. So HD, are you there? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, he's here. He says he'd plug your channel, your YouTube channel, if you had decided to start one. Yeah, you could have easily 1,000 subscribers in the space of a week.
Wow.
Okay.
Kind of crazy.
Yeah, it's fun. It's awesome. It's something that I really enjoy. Okay. So here's HD. Talk to you later, Jeff.
My phone just blew up. Okay, I gotta sign off then, and I'll leave you to Honest Discussion.
Yeah. Talk to you later, man.
Hi.
Okay. How's it going, HD?
How's it going?
Oh, it's going pretty good. I felt like that was a pretty interesting conversation. I liked it.
I like it a lot. I want you to tell him that I will give him a plug as well if he comes on YouTube. I think we need more people that are honestly into the more intellectual pursuits, and we've got plenty of people on YouTube making cat videos. I think we need to focus more on discussion and that sort of thing. So yeah, I definitely give him a plug if he were to come up on YouTube.
Yeah, I think he would do well. The problem is he doesn't, he doesn't have a webcam, so that's probably the biggest inhibition for him at the moment.
You can get a really decent webcam for like $50.
Yeah, but he's an unemployed philosopher. He doesn't make a whole lot of money. But like I was telling him, you don't even need a webcam. You just go onto Extra Normal and you can just type up your scripts and they'll animate it for you. I think there's a couple other services that do something similar.
Do you know what he was talking about with the possible seed of consciousness? What something for the nucleus?
Yeah, no, that was news to me too. I hadn't heard about that before. I saw the comment that you made that it's the consciousness isn't seated in a specific spot, and yeah, I think that's probably compatible. And he's probably sort of simplifying for the purposes of conversation. It's not as simple as this is where the seat of consciousness is. But it does seem to at least be an integral component to consciousness. It seems.
What was that called?
I'll ask him, and I can. Is he still on Gmail? He's on Gmail chat. Hang on, let me.
If we could post that in the chat over there, I think that'd be a good idea. Not that I want to know it as well.
Yeah. Okay. I just sent him a chat. I don't know if he's still by his computer. Hopefully he'll. All right. There he is. Okay. It is the. Yeah. Okay. Intralaminar nucleus of the thalamus. I'll put that in the chat.
Yeah, please, because that's exactly what we've been sort of looking for. I always was under the impression that one study that did I talk to you about this with the giving small electrical shocks to people when they were awake in their brains and small ones when they were sleeping and looking at the difference.
I don't think you have talked to me. I don't know the study.
Well, they did just that. They'd they put little electrodes on people's brains and give them little shocks while they were conscious and while they were unconscious. The difference they saw is that while they were conscious, the electrical pulses traveled in between brain regions. When they were unconscious, it stayed very localized in that area.
That is interesting.
So whatever's happening when we're conscious, it seems to be that there's a lot of information exchange between not just hemispheres, but different areas, like the inner and the outer area of the brain. And when we're not conscious, those things can still be active, but so they're not sharing information.
Right. But that, of course, doesn't mean that said sharing of information is responsible for consciousness. It might be a side effect of consciousness or something like that.
I would say it sounds likely as though it's at least a component.
Yeah.
Would be necessary.
That wouldn't surprise me either. That it might be a component. Again, I don't. Yeah. I'm obviously way outside of my expertise. We should get Michael in on this. He'd probably be more knowledgeable on this than either of us.
Which one's Michael?
Michael. Damn it.
Oh. No, I thought you said Dennett. I'm like, wait a minute, that's Dan.
No. From Canada, the neuroscientist. I'm blanking on his last name. He's on YouTube. We talked to him just the other day.
The neuroscientist?
Peyton. Thank you, Michael Peyton. Yeah.
Oh, Michael Peyton.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, duh.
Yeah.
I was talking to Nate Phelps earlier today, and he knows Michael as well.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, because Michael interviewed him, didn't he?
They worked together at the Center for Inquiry.
Oh, okay, nice.
So yeah. Apparently, Michael Peyton has another channel that he never told me about. Something to do with the CIC, or the Center CFI. Yeah, that's it. So I'm going to go yell at him for not telling me. Or maybe he did tell me and I just forgot.
Right.
Do you mind if I bring someone else on the conference too?
Not at all. Bring them all in.
Let me see if Adam's around. Do you know the Man of Earth? Have you guys ever talked?
I don't think we've ever talked, but I've seen some of his videos. I don't think I'm subbed to him. I probably should be, but I've seen some of his vids.
No, I don't really like him. I just pretend to.
All right.
No, he's a great guy. I'm going to see if he's there. Oh, there he is.
Do you want to take over the video, by the way, since my ugly mug has been kind of hogging the screen space here?
Why do you think the viewers went up? I mean...
Went up? No, they went down. It was 150-something when I logged on. It's down to 134 now.
Oh, it was? Oh, okay. I'm fine with doing it this well. Okay, well... I'm going to be on later on as well, so let's see. Actually, we might be able to get all of us on here. Tell you what, everyone, we will be back in just a minute. Are you still with us?
Yep. I'm counting my new subscriptions. Looks like I got a total of 4 subscriptions from this thing so far.
Yay! I don't think I've got any, actually.
Got one.
I got one?
I got one.
Oh, okay.
Is that you, Adam?
Yep, it's me.
All right. So, is the video that's rolling now a pre-recorded one?
It is, but we're now online. We're back live. You might need to reinitialize your video camera though, so we can see all 3 of us.
Okay.
Can't see you either, HD.
Yes, you can.
Okay.
All right. So let me see.
Hey, there you are.
Yeah. So it's more than one camera. Is that what it's talking about down here?
You were logged on to. You have to reinitialize your camera, basically.
Okay. How do
you have to unplug it and plug it back in.
Unfortunately, it's built in. I'll try reloading the page, so I'll disappear for a second probably.
You have to hang up on Skype and restart the program.
Okay, yeah, it's asking me.
If you don't have your face on there, then it won't matter that much. Adam and I, and Sisyphus also want to let everyone know that if you've been enjoying this and you want to keep America's military secular, not necessarily atheist, but if you don't want people to be evangelizing to our soldiers and forcing them to go to concerts, please click on the talkinact.com/blog link at the bottom of your screen. And if you've got any money to donate, that we'd really appreciate that. Deborah's asking if we're on for an hour. We are on, actually, for just another 10. Actually, no, are we on for another hour? Let me look at the schedule here. No, we were on for about another hour, yeah. You don't have to be honest, if you've got something else to do, but I certainly wouldn't mind talking to you more.
Yeah, I can stick around for at least a little bit. I'm starting to get a little hungry. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, I'm muted now. Okay, activating my...
That's a mistake everyone makes, so don't worry about that.
Yeah, noob mistake, total. Okay, alright. Now, I remember there. Okay, my camera light's on, and I see my face. Do I need to cue myself? Is that what I need to do?
No, you're live.
Oh, okay.
We're all live. What I'm doing is I'm streaming my desktop to the event, and that's why we can see Adam and me at the same time. If you restarted Skype, we'd be able to see all three of us at once.
All right. Yeah. Well, don't screw that. You know, everyone knows what I look like at this point. I'll just be the voice.
Okay. That's fine. I understand. So yeah. How did the good doctor that emailed both of us, the psychokinesis guy, what did his latest email say? Did he mention his different dualism stance?
You know, I actually didn't read past the first paragraph because in the first paragraph he said, like, you're laughably wrong about psychokinesis. There's tons of evidence proving it's correct. And, you know, I really want to be fallibilistic. I want to be open-minded. I want to say, okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I have been selectively hearing the evidence that I want to hear against it or something like that. But it seems that the only people who promote it are either people who have an agenda. I've yet to hear a legitimate scientist say that we've got solid reason for believing that psychokinesis works. So...
Mm-hmm. What's your take on this, Adam? Because you're the one that said that, you know, the whole you thought his meta-analysis wasn't very accurate.
Well, I don't generally consider meta-analysis to be, well, in fact, as far as I know, meta-analysis isn't it's considered anecdotal evidence at best. In general, if you're doing a meta-analysis. Mainly because the studies, a meta-analysis